Well, we're still in the middle of an introductory part of the talks. We're trying to eventually understand hierarchies in our own consciousness. What is more important than what else? What is more antecedent to what else? What is more contingent on what other thing? But before we can look at hierarchies of consciousness, we are looking at consciousness itself. And to do that, we're doing something foolhardy. We're talking about God. And we're talking about the three attributes of God, and we've been talking about it in terms of Hindu stories. We first spoke about the first attribute by telling stories on Brahma. And then we talked about Vishnu last time. And this time we're going to tell stories about Shiva. And this was an exceedingly hard talk to do because we're probably only going to be telling 1% of what is available. And out of what is available, out of what there was in the original literature, only 7% of that is available. So it is a vast amount of information that's available, and it's also very, very filled with ideas, which we'll probably go into a lot of side trips with. And so we'll start talking about the third quality of the divine. And the problems with Shiva are the same as we've had with the others, is that there's such a wide variety of information. Only with Shiva it is more so. I think it's a general universal law that the more deeply one is involved with matter, the more one becomes manifest, the more details there are, the more ramifications there are. In fact, I think that's one of the purposes of an external manifestation, is to carry simple principles out to their fullest extent and develop all the possibilities of them, and in them gain the kind of experience that is necessary for growth. Another reason for this is that the myths of Shiva appear very late in history, when writing was quite prolific and all of the advocates of the new divinity did everything that they could to further their cause. In fact, it's the followers of Shiva that are really the partisan ones, and they're the ones that trounce all of the other people. And the thing is that Shiva existed before that God was known as Shiva, and it was given all sorts of other names, and one of those early names was Rudra. And since there were a whole bunch of Rudras, it becomes even more of a hodgepodge that's hard to figure out. So let's take from the Sapata Brahmana, and we'll go back to one of the stories only told in a different way this time. Prajapati was again uniting with his own daughter. And interesting aside on that, the reason why Brahma has three faces is when he, out of his one side, he brought his daughter, and he fell in love with her. And at the same time he was in love with her, his consciousness in her was a shame. And he gazed on her, and as he was looking at her, he was fixed on her whole being and fixed in desire, and she was fixed on him in fear and in shame, and she realized that he was stuck. So what she did is stepped aside. And when she stepped aside, then he had to look a different way. And when he looked a different way, another face came up, and that's where the 4 directions came from in terms of creation, is that he put out 4 faces, and then he had all 4 directions covered. And interesting, it's not the story we were wanting to tell. But at any rate, he was uniting with his own daughter, and the other gods became angry about this. And they said, "He who does this to his own daughter, our sister, commits a sin." Of course, if there's nobody else there but the one, incest is a necessity. But there's something about that. I think that there is a spiritual side to incest. The material side we all know about, that at one time incest was perfectly possible, that people could interbreed without having things like insanity and things like that happen, because they were guided by angels and other beings from the inner worlds, and the priests knew how to, they had a form of birth control that they could determine what the characteristics of the offspring were going to be. But when it became necessary to mix the different races or to mix the different cultures, then suddenly incense became abhorrent, and all of those controls were taken away, and so all of the myths come out with a hatred of incest. But there's a spiritual reason for it also, and that is that it's sort of the idea that takes place in universities. They always try to bring in new blood, because if you get stuck in one line of thought and your students become the new professors, there is no expansion and there is no cross-checking. Everybody thinks the same way. And I think the spiritual meaning of incest, at least from the spiritual planes, has something to do that if one remained in an interned kind of consciousness and did not manifest creation and did not interact with the unknown, that it would be something like a daydream. It would be very self-satisfying and very spiritually unnourishing at the same time. So there's a reason for abhorrence on the transcendental plane also. So the gods got very angry, and they went to Rudra, who rules the beasts. Clearly, Rudra, or Shiv, the third principle of divinity. The third gets reflected into the realm of desire, or the realm of the animals, as it's called, and so that by the reflective principle, the first is reflected into the desire realm, the second is reflected into the etheric, and the first is reflected into the physical, and therefore the Rudra Shiv is called the ruler of the beasts, or the ruler of desires. And they said to him, "This one commits a transgression who does this to his own daughter, our sister. Pierce him." So Rudra got out his bow and arrow. It's one of the attributes of Rudra, is to have the bow and arrow. And it's also one of the attributes of the third to be the avenger. Now, usually in Trinity stories, the avenger avenges the father by protecting him or redeeming the loss of the image of the father in the realms of darkness. This is the case, for example, in Isis, Osiris, and Horus. Horus does away with Typhon, who is Brahma's brother, and by winning over him successive times in many cycles, he avenges his father's loss of life. But in this case, Shiv avenges against his own father, or against the first principle, And this is sort of the Lord of Justice. We'll come more to this idea later on. And he takes aim and he shoots the arrow and he strikes Brahma with it. And when this occurs, Brahma loses his seed prematurely. And in this case, it wasn't a union that was a spiritual union where they were combined, and there was a spiritual uniting and a spiritual production. There was actually a loss of seed, which was certainly not practicing asceticism. And from this comes a little bit of a story or a worldly wisdom where the sages say, when the father shed his seed in his own daughter, he spilt his seed on the earth as he united with her. And this is a chant of the Maruts, who are the followers of Rudra. And it's talking, I believe, about the quality. Remember we said a while back that there is a proportion between the transcendental realms and the material realms. And according to the Hindu mystics, the greater part of our self-being, as well as the greater part of the cosmos, is transcendental. That is the spiritual nature of things, the realm of meaning, the realm of creation, the realm of purpose takes up 3/4 of the entire cosmos, and very little is put into manifestation. I believe that is true, at least in my very little bit of experience. It's true that from a little bit of phenomenal experience, there is so much meaning that can be derived and so much can be drawn out of it that it seems only logical that the consciousness of the divine would spend most of its time pondering in the creative activity and what is derived from that creative activity. And, oh boy, from here on in the story gets really wild. I'm not even going to tell all of it because it's quite long. In fact, all of the stories of Shiv are epic in length. There are quite a few epic things. What happens is the seed is not to be wasted. And what happens is one of the gods eats it. And he goes blind. That's Bhaga. And then he gives it up because he can't handle it. And they give it to one of the solar divinities, Pusan, and it knocks all of the teeth out of his mouth. And then it goes to Brahaspati and the Lord of Speech, and he's made lame by it. And eventually it goes to Indra, and it goes through a whole chain of things like that. Interesting story, but I don't want to get too far into it. With the first attribute of spiritual consciousness of the God, we saw raw spiritual power. It willed things into being in a very stark manner. There was no need for any details. Everything was demanded. Last time we saw with the second attribute, we saw that Vishnu did everything by the imagination, that infinitely receptive kind of consciousness. It is to say that divine consciousness is complete in itself. It can conceive because it has the receptive and drawing and ever so subtle imagination at the same time that it has the power of will to inseminate that imagination with its own consciousness. This time we're seeing something much, much different. We're seeing the piercer, the arrow shooter. We're seeing a concentrated kind of consciousness. the will was general, and the imagination was general and everywhere. But with the case of Shiv, it becomes very much focused, and it becomes focused into individuality. Even though the first two attributes of our divine consciousness have character such that they can be anthropomorphized, as the Hindus tended to do, they are much better understood in a universal context. They have character, but they are not focused as individual beings. In the case of the third attribute, that is the very nature of its being altogether, is to represent an individualization. And there is a vindication from the first to the third. In fact, if you want to get into some esoteric mathematics and numerology, that the principle of the first is raw being, but that being in coming to know self, or in coming to know being, is fulfilled in the third by becoming a being, an individuality that is capable of self-knowing, and that is capable of penetrating itself in a knowledgeable way. So there is then the first two attributes of spirit are unifying. The third attribute is separative, that there is the ability to take and differentiate, to differentiate not only self, but all of the other attributes of being, especially in spirit, through the knowledge of self. Now, as we're going to look at these different mythologies during the course of the year, we're going to see each of them is very supreme in a different quality of consciousness and evolutionary development. Certainly they all had very different cultures from each other. And the thing that is supreme in the Hindu consciousness or in the Hindu religion is this concept of selfhood. It's a very transcendental spiritual selfhood, but the recognition that nothing can be understood except through the identification process of the beingness through a being knowing itself by identifying itself in different separative activities. When all of the universal consciousness is taken and focused and is pointed, you might say that you could say that the arrow of Shiv pierced both Brahma and Vishnu in effect, because it took both of the universal qualities and penetrated into them, and it made for a knowing. It's a transcendental kind of knowing, but in order for there to be consciousness, and in order for there to be a hierarchical awareness through consciousness, there has to be a specific knowing. And that attribute of the divine is found in the character of Shiv. Clearly, this is an outward kind of manifestation, and the quality here, we've been talking about the first being associated with creation, and the second being associated with emanation. The third is associated with fabrication, but that's much more in the phenomenal rather than the transcendental sense. A better way of looking at it from the way we're looking at it now is it is associated with generation. It generates things. Now, clearly, once something is generated as a thing, and it is within something very universal, once there is the possibility of a self, this creates the possibility of a myriad of selves. once there is the separation of I from all the possibilities of I-ness, there's no reason why there can't be many, many, many more. And there is that kind of generation. When the generation goes like the seed of Brahma into the phenomenal realms, and it trickles down, there is room in the cosmos for trickle-down theory, and it trickles into the material realms, and its potency being diluted at every step of the way, so that it becomes thinner and thinner, because that concentration can only be held so far. It indeed generates forms. But in the phenomenal realm, because there is a limit to manifest consciousness in its ability to penetrate into the unknown, into the potentials of time and space, there is only then so much reflective projection into the phenomenal realms, and therefore the material has to be reused. And there is a quality of recycling. And the recycling quality is very much associated with Shiv. We're going to go into that quite a bit later on tonight. And I guess I should move on, because I don't want to stay too long on this, because there are many very lovely kind of things. Okay, so there is then in Rudra Shiv an avenger, but an avenger to justice, and an avenger with painful recompense, but it is basically good. Even the name Rudra, which represents howler or ruddy one, this is associated with all of the dark light and pure light actually becoming ignited. There's every bit of evidence to indicate that Rudra, Shiva, and Agni are all the same being. It's activated into fire. But more for stories. There's one that I want to read part of, because the author does it very well, and since we're studying mythology and the cultures that they derive from, this is a classic picture. This is actually from the Mahabharata, but it's found in other places. And I chose this one because there are many, many different variations in the spiritual art of the Hindus of this picture. This is the picture sort of the whole Hindu pantheon centered around this being that is the piercing and focusing agency. There was once a peak of Mount Meru, which is sort of like the Mount Olympus, famed throughout the triple world. This peak was descended from the sun and was named Luminary. It was adorned with gems, immeasurable, unapproachable by all people. There on the mountain slope, adorned with gold and minerals, the god Shiva sat as if on a couch, shining intensely, while Parvati, the daughter of the king of the mountains, stayed at his side constantly. The noble gods, the Vasus of great vitality, the two noble Asvins, the best physicians, King Kubera, Vaisvarana, the overlord of the Yakshas, the prosperous lord who lives on Kalisa, surrounded by the Gukyakas, the divine sages with Angrias at their head, Gandharva, Visvasu, Narada, Parvata, and the massed bands of celestial nymphs, they all came there together. A clear and pleasant wind blew, wafting various perfumes. The great trees were in blossom, bearing flowers of all seasons. The Vidyaharas, the Siddhas, the ascetics all came to live with the great god, the lord of cattle. The ghosts of diverse forms, the hideous Raksasas, the Pisakas of many forms and various weapons, all the servants of the gods stood there like fires rejoicing. The Lord Nandin stood there with the gods' consent, holding the brazen trident that glowed with its with its own energies. Ganges, best of rivers, born of all the sacred waters, incarnate served the god. Thus the Lord, the great God, was worshipped there by the divine sages and by the gods of great fortune. Quite a few pictures have Brahma and Vishnu and Ganesh and all of the other gods all in company, and it's sort of like this. Shiv in this case represents the focus of the whole universe. I want to go on from there. Eventually, Brahma, this is not this Brahma, this is what's really tricky about Hindu mythology. There are so many duplications. Shiv had a brother named Brahma. And because he was he was also known as Daksa. And he's called Brahma Daksa because they were all mind-born from the one. But at any rate, while this grand celebration was going on, focused around Shiv in Mount Meru, Daksa began a Vedic sacrifice. Even the gods did Vedic sacrifices. All of the gods, even with Indra at their head, left to attend this sacrifice. And Parvati took great offense about this, and she said, where are they all going? They're leaving us. And Shiva, who's often called Mahadeva, said, the supreme Brahma is holding a Vedic sacrifice. And Parvati, who's sometimes called Uma, I'll introduce you to all of these names, said, well, what's to prevent you from going? And Shiv answers in a very diplomatic way. He says, all this was decided by the gods themselves, and in all sacrifices, since I'm a Johnny come lately, there's no place for me. There's no place designated for me. What the real story is that Shiv was such a bad boy that he was not allowed a part in any of the sacrifices. She took it to heart and she said, Lord, among all beings you are invincible, unapproachable because of your energy, fame, glory, and so on, and so on. Sinless one, great sorrow and trembling have come upon me because you have been denied a share in the sacrifices. And at that, she went silent and she had a burning heart. Loving her, Shiv read her heart, and he commanded his servant Nandan to stay with all of the other servants, and he took them all, and they attacked the sacrifice in a most riotous manner. I think I've got that part even circled here for a little reading. They're really gate crashers. Some of them emitted roars, some laughed, others sprinkled the fire with blood, some with deformed faces uprooted the sacrificial stakes and whirled them about, some swallowed up in their great mouths the priests performing the sacrifice. Then the sacrifice, attacked on all sides, took the form of a deer and flew up into the sky, but the Lord, seeing the sacrifice fleeing in that form, took up his bow and arrow and followed it. And while he's angrily knocking down the sacrifice and doing everything he can do to break up the service, a drop of sweat falls from his brow. And this time, instead of seed coming into the material world, it is sweat that comes into the phenomenal realms, and the drop of sweat becomes born as a man with hideous red eyes and a very tawny, scraggly red beard, and all of his hair stands on end, and he has so much hair that he almost looks more like a hawk or like an owl. And he had a gaping mouth with monstrous big teeth and a horrible dark complexion, and he wore nothing but red clothing. and his name was called Fever, of all things. And he started walking around the world, and as he did, everything burned up in his path, and even the earth shook like it was going to fall apart. And then Brahma, who is now seen as the grandfather, propitiated, and he offered Shiva a share in the sacrifices if he would only de-intensify the fever by dividing him into many. And Shiva, having been propitiated, he divided the fever into many things, and it became all of the illnesses that we know that burn with the power of fever. Quite interesting. We're going to go on to other parts of this story because it's a really, really long story. In fact, in this, eventually, Shiva kills his brother Daksha. But let's on to the ideas. First, we had the whole idea that there was a state of unity in Trinity, because the basic character of Spirit is one. It can never be lost, even though we can look at it with different characteristics and the different attributes of its being. There is a unity. And this unity is fulfilling. Sort of as if to say, Brahma just had the power to create. Vishnu measured out the universe and made possible all of the shapes. And what Shiv does is actually activates them, brings them to life, brings them to be individual beings. But this whole process necessitates depth, because when you have recycling and when you have only a limited amount of materials in which the evolutionary process can go, if it is indeed a closed circuit and only so much of the unknown, only so far can the one spirit, ourselves included, be projected into the unknown, because we only have that much. It means that there is a necessity for recycling, so that there is the quality that as soon as you have the third, the division and the separation is not only a separation that makes identification possible through an individuality that can see things as being different from itself, but then coming to know it actually changes them. It indicates that there is a different kind of separation, and that becomes a separation into degeneration and regeneration. So there's a constantly cyclical kind of activity. Shiv sets the whole cosmos spinning. Everything starts to go. And it's as if to say, the more we focus on self, or better said, the more we focus through self and identify the nature of reality by creating things as maybes and then realizing them as actuals and taking the essence out of all creation, that sets things spinning. The more we become generative beings, the more we start ourselves and the whole cosmos in a spinning activity. So we have here Shiv through his counterpart. You might say that desire represents the other half of Shiv. Through the principle of desire, Parvati wanted it both ways. Wanted individual being and wanted worship. Wanted an honor and such like that. And this basically, in a way, is the whole idea. This is the Hindu idea of an original sin. The original sin, which is seen in that way as a selfishness for experience or a selfishness for a special kind of experience, adulation that is being adored and being worshipped and being sacrificed to by participating in the general sacrifice from the external world. And so sin can, because of the unity of the first two attributes of being, if you just only imagine things, or if you only just associate with the power of will, there is no sin. But there is no consciousness that is gained either. Once there is a desire, and a desire for something new, and for the new things to worship you as their progenitor, once that enters into consciousness, then there is a quality that is like sin, and from that comes the whole idea of illness. Now, what is unique about this, what is different about the Oriental version from the Western version, is that the sin is transcendental. It is associated in a divine consciousness rather than in a human consciousness. In fact, you could say that that's the one thing that separates all Hindu mythology from all of the other mythology. Greeks have bad guy gods, as do the Egyptians and everybody else. But the whole idea that sin and everything else originates from the gods, in the gods, is a uniquely Hindu thing, because because their whole consciousness was focused on the gods. In fact, they didn't pay much attention to the material world, which is sort of their weakness as well as their strength. What is really unique about the Hindu version of all of this is that it is justified. That is to say, it gets its result, and its result is good. Meaning to say that this separation into an individuality, and this individuality which brings not only generation into the material world, but brings sickness and degeneration, because if things don't go into decadence and self-destroy, there is no way to get the essence of experience out of them. Because if they remained healthy and solid at all times and complete at all times, they would hold their experience and their knowledge within themselves. So what is seen as a sin is really not a sin. The separative quality, when brought into the material world as a desire for change, or a desire, well, you know what happens, we talked last time, was a fish eat fish world, according to the Hindus, that those very qualities are what brought the fever. It brought in the necessity for the sacrifice, and the necessity for the sacrifice to a god as an individuality rather than as a higher principle. And so the idea of sin as being transcendental and being a perfectly justifiable thing to be an engine to drive all of the phenomenal creation and to cause it to degenerate so that the experience can be brought out of it is quite a unique way. So what we're seeing here, we're seeing that the character of Shiv, or that the third attribute of the divine relative to human consciousness, is very much like the third attribute as seen in Judeo-Christianism. Jehovah is also seen as a jealous, as a vindictive, as a very violent kind of God. And there is that separativeness that is born of individuation there. So we're seeing an active destruction, and an active destruction that comes from the divine, and it fulfills a definite purpose. So the birth of the self leads to the possibility of the creation being completed, but its completion also leads to its destruction, which is also its fulfillment, such that the lonely first principle, because it is all alone. You take willful people, extremely willful people, become very lonely people because nobody can stand to be around them because of their eminent power of being. Everyone else is driven off, and the spiritual psychology of loneliness as we saw when we talked about Brahma created so that it wouldn't be alone and that its loneliness is assuaged, and it's assuaged through the grandson, which is really interesting because there are characteristics in human genetics that things are not often reborn from father to son, but are very likely to be reborn from father to grandson. But that's a whole other thing, and I don't know if I want to go into that. So this is the ignition, you might say, of the divine consuming fire that is ignited in the person of the third. Now, I'm going to give you another variant of the same story, and it is a much more, we're going to come in the middle, and it's a much more elaborate version of it. This is from the Varaha Purana. Rudra was weeping. It doesn't say why he was weeping, but that's one of the characteristics of Rudra. He is the howler or the wailer. And I think this has something to do with the introvertive phase of consciousness. It seems that the expressive and the materializing quality is like in the process of creation or in generation, there is the quality of laughter. Creation is always a joy, but the psychology that is necessary for drawing in the essence of all things is the quality of sorrow, because that's what attends the decadence, and that is the grief and the sorrow and the remorse is what literally draws out not only what was originally projected into the reality, but the new things that come out of it. This is why the whole process of grieving and all of the howling and wailing that goes with it in spirit, if not in voice, is so necessary, because that is the quality that draws just as much as the joy and the laughter of outpouring is what makes the creation possible. The destruction is of that nature. Brahma is crying, and he says, "Ooh, am I on the right page here? Yeah, I guess I'm all right. Oh, we're going into the same story from a much different place. We're going to come back to it another way. I went through so many myths this week. I put in an enormous amount of study. That's what it's going to make. I'm going to have to be work very hard to cut this short. Brahma says, "Do not weep. Perform, create, and cause it to be diffused with your own image. For you are capable of this, as you have great splendor." I'm sure that it was Brahma through the word that spoke to Shiv. You are capable is a code word for saying you are the generator. This was at a time that all there was water. And Rudra plunged into the water and manifest the offspring of Brahma in the water. At the same time, his brother Daksha was performing a creation for his own welfare. Now this brings it on to, let's go on. At any rate, all of the creation was being diffused by Rudra. Daksha was enthusiastically sacrificing to Brahma, and all of the gods were attending the sacrifice by Daksha. Now, Rudra, or Shiv, was a somewhat conceited person. He said he saw his conceit in his own brother, and he says, "What infatuated or conceited person has created this universe, thus insulting this shining maiden," his wife, Devi and overreaching me. Rudra was lamenting, and flames came out of his mouth, and out of these flames came vampires and ghosts and bands of yogis and everything else. And he made a bowl, and he made the bowl huge, very strong, and he spun a threefold bowstring, and he made 2 celestial quivers, and he made arrows and placed them in there. I don't know how much I want to go into asides on that. I think I'll just not go into any, and I'll let you, because others will be way too long. He then went and he blinded Bhaga, he detoothed Pusan, he castrated Kratu, and did all of the things like that, and he reduced all of the gods to beasts. I mean to say, he plunged everyone into the phenomenal consciousness. And Brahma, who enjoyed the sacrifice, said, don't let the sacrifice be destroyed by anger. In short, if there is a creative activity that goes from Brahma to Vishnu to Shiv, from the creation to the imagination, or from creation to the emanation to the fabrication, he says, turn it back. Don't let it go so far that it is open-ended. It means drawing the creation back in. That is not only just drawing it in a transcendental fantasy type of consciousness, but drawing it back in the creation. And don't go so far that you take all of my creative energy and perform things and then burn them up and kill them. Bring them back in also. So he says, don't carry it too far, in effect. And Shiv or Rudra Shiv says to him, you have made me before these. Why have they not given me part of the sacrifice? I have defended them and now I will deprive them of knowledge. And then Brahma says, all you gods and demons must now sacrifice and praise Sambhu, which is another name for it. There are 1,000 of them. And the gods then all say to Rudra, grant us Vedic knowledge and restore the sacrifice with its secret doctrines, and please us with it. And Rudra says, you will be beasts and I will be your Lord. And this is how the beasts came to be. It's sort of like saying, boy, this is a concept that I wasn't prepared to go into. It's sort of like saying that when individuation takes place and all of the gods come into individuation through the character of the third attribute of the divine, and once there is self-knowing and a hunger like the fire of Agni for more knowledge and the necessity to plunge into the phenomenal realms, then it becomes necessary for all of the divine beings to lose their divine character and themselves be sacrificed into the material worlds, and they become, so to speak, beasts. We would think of them probably as nature forces, that the divine consciousness of the various attributes of the one, of the manifest beings within the one, when they become phenomenally manifest, they become the forces of nature, principles of nature, the beasts or the engines that drive the material cosmos that is within us. And this is what Shiv demands of them, because it's what they themselves demand. Once you have self-knowledge, whether it is a conceited self-knowledge or whether it is a sacrificial self-knowledge, that demands to be fed, as we saw when we saw the myth of Agni a few weeks ago. Then, oh boy, what happens, this is actually I don't know how to go into all of these things. This is the original Abel-Cain story. What happens in this is when Daksha takes the form of a human or takes a phenomenal form, he's caught by Shiv and he's murdered. But because he's so beloved by the gods, they ask him to resuscitate Daksha. But by then, Daksha's head has burned off. This is a myth that's filled with all kinds of variants I'd love to go into, but can't. His head gets burned, and they can't put a charred head back on the body, even though he's immortal. So what they do is they go get a goat, and they cut the head off of a goat, and they sew the goat's head onto Daksha, and he comes back to life. I don't know how to say this, but the various versions of the myth of Rudra, Shiv, and Daksha are the Indian version of the Abel and Cain story. That the sacrifice of Cain, this is much different. This is much more like occultism teaches it. That the sacrifice of Cain is more perfect, but that it leads to the death of Abel. But that this death is a very necessary thing. From the vantage point of the Judeo-Christian view, the second sin, the sin of murder and the sin of death, the first sin was the sexuality that led to a generation outside of the Garden of Eden, outside of the realm of the gods. The creation now was to a place that was much more rugged and was not tended like the garden was. The second sin that comes from that is the sin of murder, meaning to say that from generation and generation in ignorance or into the realms of ignorance, from that is born the knowledge of death. And this is knowledge that is born from material experience. And I must say it that in reading these stories, my understanding of the Bible has very much improved. And this really sheds light onto the Abel and Cain story in showing that the death was a necessity and that the sacrifice was not merely a material sacrifice where people started killing each other. That is one of the phenomena that came out of this when this myth was relived among human beings, and when it was relived among human beings on a very much lower level and a very much misunderstood level. But the myth of Abel and Cain, of the two fighting brothers, of Rudra and Daksha, is the myth of the necessity of a sacrifice into the death of manifest being. It's sort of like a to be or not to be kind of thing that, yes, we have to be. So you go down, Daksha, and that's the way, it is. It shows then that with the birth of individuality and the separation of self from not self, or from what is and was from what is becoming, that separation leads to a kind of longing. And that kind of longing for new experience and for that which is separated into the phenomenal realms is literally what produces desire. And that desire is itself an experience of the divine in its quest for spiritual growth, it projects into the realms, into the phenomenal realms where we derive our motivation as a principle of desire. So there is this longing and there is this jealousy. I don't know how you would describe jealousy. I guess you would say the divine concept of jealousy is to see self projected into the phenomenal and to see it as more beautiful than yourself because it has not become, because it's always in a state of potential. And what is in a state of potential always has more promise than what already is, even if what already is divine. And this desire or this jealousy and this need to do something about the reflected projection of individuality as the personality of nature has a very deep spiritual psychology, and the jealousy is what is the driving energy behind the degeneration and regeneration of the forms in the phenomenal existence. All right. I told you it was going to be a hard night because there are so many ideas that are so deep. I have never gone through 3 months of so many ideas that are so pondersome that I can't take the time to get at the a full working out of it all, that it's been really frustrating as well as a joyous type. But at any rate, there is then the acceptance, the demanded acceptance of Rudra as sort of a foreigner, as a rebel, and that is the acceptance of what is new. The foreign is always something that is different from ourselves, and that difference, it leads to a longing as much as it leads to a revulsion of ourselves. So we see in this the ultimate power of the individuated nature of being as self. This is why the third attribute is, even in the West, when it's seen as Jehovah, is always seen as the greatest. This is why the name Mahadeva, meaning great or greatest God, is given to Rudra Shiv, because it is the first that really is an individual. From the spiritual point of view and from the point of view of internal consciousness, that which is pointed to by Brahma and Shiv, even though they're given anthropomorphic materializations, really are something that is so universal and something that is so infinite that you can't really say that this is an individual being. And it isn't until the third entity is brought out of them that it becomes an individual. All right. And that's why the whole nature of divinity as a God, whether it is the one with a capital G or as a God with a small g, it's so ironic that at the same time when the potentiality of godhood becomes possible for all of the manifest foci of the one that have been from all of these past creations, when the potential of individuation takes place, what happens that they can become gods? What do? They become beasts. It's a divine kind of irony, and it's most okay. I wanted to go into one of the epic myths, and I skipped probably the most famous one, and that is where it's one of the battles of the gods with the demons, and where 3 demons are given power to overcome the entire cosmos, and they would take it over altogether if it weren't for the action of Shiv in destroying them. but the myth is way too long and it has way too many little sub-stories in it that I just had to skip it all together. It's when three cities become bigger and bigger and bigger. It's sort of like our times when the cities become so big that they join each other, and when they join each other, they fuse into a one, and at that point they are destroyed by Shiv. It's obviously a cosmological myth that has to do with the whole second half of the universe that I'd love to go into, but I'm just going to have to go aside on all of that. Instead, I'm going to take some of the cycles from that deal with Shiv and Parvati and Kama, who is the Lord of Desire. This is the first time we're going to read from the Saura Purana, and we'll start talking again about demons. There was a demon named Taraka, and he was practicing asceticism so much that Brahma was pleased with him, and he received a boon from Brahma, and that death was that he wouldn't die except by any of the gods, except that he was, I think, someone who would eat Mahadeva's seed. I don't know, as we go through the story. I've been through so many stories. They're all running together. He became stronger than most of the gods, and he carried forcibly off the wives of all of the gods, meaning to say that the projections of all of the gods into the material realms could be seen as wives. And Daksha, representing the consciousness that is becoming divine, rather than that which is already divine in the gods, represents the demons that are in the phenomenal realms. And then the 33 chief gods in misery came to Brahma and said, our wives have been taken away. And Brahma says to them, well, what are you afraid of? You're gods. Tell me and I will find a means of helping you. And the gods all say, we are terrified of Taraka. And so they do battle. And after 30,000 years, they're not skimpy with their numbers at all. That's even a small one. Vishnu battles with Taraka for 30,000 years, and he can't overcome them, and he retreats to the ocean in confusion or in chaos. And Brahma says, well, when I saw his asceticism was scorching the dual universe, moving and still, I granted him a boon. And Taraka, his boon was, grant that I not die of any of the gods, but only by one, when the gods, Vishnu included, become pregnant by drinking the seed of the god above gods, the red and blue one with the braided hair. Shiv is red. Shiv is the being of action, except that his throat is blue, because at one time poison was invented, and the whole cosmos was threatened, and Shiv swallowed the poison. He didn't swallow it, he held it in his throat, and his throat became blue. It's a wonderful myth that has to do with the twofold creative energy in the genitals and in the voice box. And it has also, to deal with the whole quality of generation of Shiv. And it also has to do with the whole principle of the creative energy, even as semen or pollen or anything like that being heavily protein is the thing that's most likely to be poisonous, as is the generative energy itself likely to be poisonous for the person who's not ready for it. What's that famous line in Zanoni for that? For he who is not tempered the elixir is the most deadly poison. Wonderful, wonderful line. So the gods all in convocation went to Mount Meru, and at Mount Meru, Vishnu and the sun god Indra were there, and they were delighted to greet them. And Indra, who is now the king of the gods, stated the business to Vishnu, to Brahm. This is what our problem is. And Vishnu thought of karma and created desire, of kama. And he created desire, and desire takes the form of something like the Cupid in the Western mythology. And kama volunteers his service and offers to overcome with desire any female and any consort. And Indra dispatches him, and he sends him off to Shiva to make him unite with Parvati. So because they need the seed of Shiv in order to overcome this demon. So Kama takes the form of a southern breeze, and he gets past the three-eyed Nandin who guards the mountain. At this point, Shiv is deep inside of the mountain, and Parvati is the goddess of the mountain meaning the place of elevated consciousness. And he stands there, and he is contemplating Shiva because he's so beautiful and he's so shining. And he contemplates him for 60 million years. This is a story that's one of the only things that's longer than these talks. And Shiv is contemplating himself, and he's focused inward, and Parvati is asleep with him, and they're sort of like in what some people would call a trance, but it really isn't a trance. It's a very, very deep self-contemplation. And he opens his eyes, and he sees his wife Parvati practicing asceticism going on, and then he senses something is going on here. And he senses kama, he senses desire, and he sees kama, and the fire from his eye burns kama up immediately. I have all kinds of asides there, but I'm going to skip them. And that done, he offers Parvati a boon, and she says, no happiness can come between a male and a female without emotion, without desire, without feeling, and you just did desire in. You just killed them. You must bring them to life. And Shiv, who is the master at getting around it, he says, I didn't kill him, but the power of my eye killed him. What can I do? And Kali Parvati says to him, you might just as well burn me too. You're the eye of the universe. I come to you for protection. You do it all. And then Hara, not Hari, but Hara, which is another name for Shiv, says, I am shamed and propitiated. Let Kama Madna live in the bodies of all of the heat in the world. Interesting, because heat, from an occult point of view, is the result of the sacrifice of love. And when we talk about the heat of the desire, the whole desire that seeks to reunite things with the individual consciousness that is projected in them, that it is that desire that draws them together, and it is that which does the sacrificing in the same place. So we see Shiv, who all these many, many millions of years, probably many more before the 60 million that Kama was standing before him, contemplates himself. Now, this is a really, really interesting conception. Shiva is the ultimate Descartes. You know, with the I think, therefore I am, therefore I think I am. In the character of Shiv, we now understand the third principle of the divine more completely. It is a process of thought. But the thought, since it is transcendental, is the formation of ideas. So when we talk about divine intelligence, or divine knowing, or divine wisdom, that is the property of the third attribute of divinity. That which has and knows consciousness, that knowledge comes about through the third attribute, through thinking. Therefore, the I of the universe, EYE and the I, is a product of thinking about self, or better said, thinking through self. The cosmos itself, in the manifest phenomenal sense, is definitely a process of concrete thinking or concreting thought. So what we're talking about here is a process of thought projected into the world, and the projection into the world manifests as a desire because of the separation that takes place in the thinking process. To look at it another way, from the way we've been looking at it, if being in its simplest essence is indicated by the first, and it comes into knowing itself or becoming a being or an individuation in the third, that which is truth in the highest sense is made into known truth, or into the capability of knowing anything through the third. You might say that when we say that we are forming ideas in our divine consciousness, we say we are conceiving ideas. And that conception is the form of generation and is the form of fabrication out of the two purely spiritual realms into something that can be known. And so we're seeing now then that the third attribute of being, and the attribute that realizes as well as produces the potential for greater realization, is a process of thinking, conceptual, ideational thinking. But it's also a forming of ideas not just about divine things, but about the potential that is in phenomenal matter. And what we're saying then is that all awakening to Godhood is a process of thinking. Thinking about the spiritual meanings of things and thinking about things that have spirit within them. So this divine being that radiates power out of its eye, this divine being shines. And this is the God of gods, meaning to say the divine made into Godhood is a being of radiant light. And so it is a ignited fire, and the ignition is brought through the very, very painful, sacrificial, separating process of thinking. You might say that the unity of spirit is so thick with itself, just like Vishnu was perfectly receptive and ever so rare that it was as thick as rock or even thicker than rock, that the first two attributes of the divine are so continuous and so contiguous that there is no separation. But in the process of separation or of thinking, which forms hollows and relates a space-like consciousness, is how the divine is born. This is the divine as activity. This is the ironic part about it again. Shiv sits for all of these millions and millions and millions of years thinking, but it is out of this thinking that all of the activity in the cosmos takes place. Everything is generated into being. It's sort of like, this is an idea that Tolkien uses very well in the Lord of the Rings. Everything happens around Gandalf, and all Gandalf ever does is just a presence there. He's quietly thinking, and all the activities coming on. Now, we're going to carry on the story to a different. We're going to move to the Shiva Purana now. We're going to tell the same story from different Puranas. When the flame of Shiva's eye burned up Kama, the whole threefold world flamed. And as the world was burning up, there was a great cry to Brahma from every being in the world. And Brahma went to Shiva and he humbly reminded him that he had to protect his generation in the threefold universe. And what happens then is Brahma paralyzed the flame. I don't know how to say this. Paralysis as an illness has to do with the application of will. Paralysis is astrologically associated with Pluto, which relates to the character of the will in the divine. This is literally another story from a much different point of view of fever being brought into the world and being held in the world. When desire was burned up and the whole world was being sacrificed relentlessly, the power of the will froze, so to speak, or at least made a super cool liquid of the manifest creation and made it be a paralyzed type of fire. That ultimately the creation, even though it takes place through Shiv, is a manifestation of the will of the divine. How great the will of the divine is determines the extent, the density, the concentration of manifest being of the cosmos. And the withdrawal of that will, once the whole world again bursts into flame, I think we're going to come to that later on. We'll talk a little bit about the destruction of the world according to Shiv. That the removal or the withdrawal of that will allows everything to go back up into flame and into the spirit again. But at any rate, everything what happened when, here's a story that gets really weird. All of the flame, when it was frozen, Brahma takes it to the ocean. And he puts it in the flames of a mare. Now this I'm not going to attempt to try and deal with this whole myth. We'll have a little of it when we come to Indra. We'll talk a little bit about it. But he puts the flame as an ambrosia into the mare, and he takes the mare and puts it into the ocean, and he speaks to the ocean, and puts the mare in the ocean. And I want to just read the lines because they're really, really very beautiful. This is, by the way, a readable translation of the, I've got a number of unreadable translations, which I get a lot out of. He takes it to the ocean. When Brahma heard the words of the ocean spoken so gladly, he remembered Sankara and spoke for the benefit of the world, saying, "Wise one, you who bring about the welfare of the world, great ocean, listen, and I will gladly tell you, for I am urged by Shiva's wish in my heart. This great power that has become a mare is the anger of the great Lord, which having burnt Kama, desire, quickly became desirous of burning everything. At the wish of Sankara and the importunity of the suffering gods who came quickly to me, I paralyzed the fire, gave it in the form of a mare, and brought it here to show it to you, to beg you to show pity. O bearer of waters, Lord of rivers, this anger of the great Lord in the form of a mare with flames in her mouth must be held by you until the final flood, when I will come and dwell here, and you will release this marvelous anger born of Sankara. Your water will be its constant food, and you must control it with great care so that it does not reach inside you." Lovely, lovely story. Within a story, within a story. So the ocean agrees to hold the fire until the final flood. What we're seeing here is again the whole idea of the spiritual fire being projected into the essence of space. If spirit is associated with time and matter is associated with space, the production again of an animal, and an animal that is placed within the waters or within the ocean, is the whole of the notion of the complementation of fire and water. Fire needs quenching by water. Water needs to be activated or taken through its cycle by fire. And the subterranean mare represents the fire as a reflective projection being placed into space, being placed into matter. And it's sort of like the germ of, like in the yin and yang, the germ of each side is found in the other. And so what is taking place here is that the whole seed, the individual atom that comes about as the idea, that is the primordial atom, that is born out of the thought of Shiva, is projected into the world, and it is seen as a fire that would burn up everything in the world if the great God were to keep his attention on it, and the creation would be over in a flash, and there would be no experience gained from it because it would be burned out instantaneously. So the principle then of projecting it into water, where there is a slow burn and there is the very patient activity of nature, is what is indicated by the engendering of the world with the subterranean mare, which keeps the world hot and keeps it going, but that the waters of materialism subdue the fire until it is time for it all to be raised to a higher level and consumed by the fire again. Oh boy, I'm tiring already, and we're not even halfway. Oh, we're over halfway. So. I don't know exactly what I want to desire is the source of the creation of the gods. Ultimately, the seed of loneliness, the desire for companionship that was born in Brahm, that started the whole business, that desire is the source of all creation. That same desire is the destruction of all creation. This is why, according to the Hindu mythology, alas, all is in the beginning and the end, not but a desire. And so we understand the principle, the third principle of divinity, is desire held in abeyance. Because I don't know how to say this. Because in the same way that the fire is quenched or subdued, at least in the waters of material space, the principle of desire is held in abeyance by will and imagination, by the divine power of will and the divine power of loving, that there is a transcendence of divine desire, and it also holds in abeyance lest there would be a self-destruction on the transcendental level. So the thing that makes for the transformation, not only the birth of the gods, but for the transformation of the gods and for an evolution of consciousness within the divine part of the gods and within our own being, is a desire. But the whole idea is that by the application of love and by the application of will, that principle of desire in the transcendental sense is kept within bounds. And when we're talking about the threefold triangle that rotates on itself, it rotates on itself both in the transcendental and in the phenomenal. Truly, each of the attributes, we have them in a stacked fashion, so that Brahma is more important than Vishnu, or is more primal than Vishnu, and both are more primal than Shiv. Truly, the divine is all present at all times, and that there is an equality as much as there is a unity in spirit, and that each of these is absolutely necessary to the other, and that the control, you might say the self-control, is not just controlling self, it is controlling oneself with regard to actions. It is a control of selfhood itself. And this is part of the divine, I don't know how you say it, the part of the divine ongoing self-knowing creative activity. I don't know, it's too cyclical. All right, but we at least have a little bit better idea of the generator, creator, destroyer. Now let's go on from telling a little bit more of the story. Meanwhile, while the horse is being placed in the bottom of the ocean, the heat that has come from the horse gets to Shiva, and he and Parvati begin making love. And they make love for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Just the foreplay itself is thousands and thousands of years. And it becomes so much so that the earth begins shaking and the air becomes compressed, and the compressed air is already threatening the gods because the whole cosmos is collapsing. This is obviously some really divine kind of concentration. And so all the gods go to the mountain, and to be told by the doorkeeper that they can't get in because Shiv's in Parvati's chambers deep in the heart of the mountain. And the gods let out a wail. And this interrupts Shiv, and he hears them, but he continues making love for a few more millions of centuries, but eventually comes to the door. And they say, do what must be done. Bhava, remember this all started with the demons, Bhava needs to be destroyed, Bhava, you need to destroy the demons. And Shiv tells them, what's going to happen to you, you cannot prevent. And who will now take my seed that has been shed? So when he came to the door of womb, he just shed his seed. And Agni is fool enough, and he takes the form of a dove, and he takes up all of the seed. This is obviously the same story that we talked about 2 years ago as the story of distribution. Remember when they cut up the body of Dionysus and distributed it through all of the parts of the world, and that the unity of the divine was distributed through all of the various diverse principles of manifest being. That's the same thing as the seed of Shiv being taken up by Agni, which is the fire that burns in the material world. And it always, again, comes down to the woman. And Parvati comes to the door, and she's angry, and she says, you only think of yourselves, even though you ruined my erotic pleasure. It took me all these millions of years for him to get warmed up to me, and then you interrupt my pleasure. And she curses them. She curses them and says, from henceforth, the wives of the gods will be barren, and all who oppose me will be miserable. So in effect, all of the gods have been castrated. Then she curses Agni to be forever omnivorous and forever tortured for wanting to burn and burn and burn. That's what the desire principle becomes. And at this point she gives birth to Ganesh, who's the elephant god, but we won't go into that right now. I don't know if we'll ever get into it if this continues much longer. And as the gods then make burnt offerings to propitiate Shiv, and when they do so, the fire works its way into them as heat, and they all become pregnant from the fire of Shiv, and they all from the fire of Agni, which contains now the seeds of Shiv. This is like saying that once there has been sin, because all sin comes through Shiv, though the Hindus would never say that, once there has been sin, and the seed of Shiv has been spread out, it's been distributed, and it is being consumed by the principle of desire, this also is taken up into the gods. Meaning to say that all of the divinity of the divine, all of the goodness that is born in the universe is born out of sin, born out of our sin. This is a much different kind of consciousness that, it's again an irony, it's a much different kind. Do that, it'll set us a little bit behind. They all become pregnant from him. I don't know. I don't know how to talk about all these things. I'm only saying about 10% of what I wanted to say. I wanted to talk about cooked food and how sin made cooked food necessary and all of those kinds of things. But it's too much. And so they all come to Shiv, and they're pregnant, and they're filled with remorse. Because remorse is what's behind sorrow, which is why remorse is the tears, and it's the sucking quality of remorse when you look back at things that draws the essence out of the sinful material life that we live in now. And they're just filled with remorse, and they're pregnant by his illusion is the word, the fire of illusion, meaning to say the projection into this world, which is not the reality of divine consciousness. It's an illusory type of consciousness. Shiv hears him out, and he promises him relief, but they first have to vomit out their sin. And so they all start vomiting. And clearly this is a very, very esoteric thing. You know, if we could hit all of the material that's in these things, I've never found anything so fertile as this. Through the fire of the sun, in both, even in etheric sense, as well as in a deeply spiritual sense, into our bodies we relive this experience where we as gods take in a germ of solar consciousness, and it goes down and it is transformed or regenerated in the generative organs, and it comes back up the spine, and the whole process of vomiting, which is a regurgitation, which is going the opposite direction from that which comes to us in the monthly spiritual cycle, where the solar energy comes down and is vivified and re-rises. The whole principle, this is not talking about vomiting, it's about spewing things out like that. It is the process of the spiritual fire, the sexual energy that has been transformed and regenerated, and this is turned upwards. This is a process that takes place in humans. It is a process that takes place in divine beings, and it is the same kind of activity. What happens is the seed, when they vomit it all out, becomes a shining golden mountain, and the gods are all relieved. And Agni asks to be removed of burning. And Shiva says, leave your portion of the seed carefully in some good woman or women, and you will be relieved. And Agni says, no woman in the threefold universe could bear your seed. Then the sidekick to Shiva, who's called Narada, says, go to the river where the women bathe at dawn in the first month of summer. There are 7 women that are holy women, and they go bathing right before dawn in the first month of summer. And these women go into the river, and it's icy cold because it's where it comes out of the mountains. And when they get out of the water, they're cold. And they say, let's go over to the fire. And one of them, the oldest, says no. So the other 6 go, and they warm themselves by the fire. And when they warm themselves by the fire, the seed of Agni comes in through the hair follicles, which I could go into, but I just won't. And the 6 of them become pregnant. And 6 husbands become angry. And so what they all do is they collectively go up to a Himalayan peak, and they abort themselves, and they make one common embryo of seed on the top of the Himalayan peak. But the peak, as strong as it is, can't bear it. And so it dumps it into the river Ganga, which is the Ganges River. And Ganga can't bear it, and he dumps it into the mud by the reeds. And it immediately becomes a beautiful boy. This is obviously the same story again as we had with Osiris Horus, and we had Moses being born by the reeds in the mud, and we had the same thing with Perseus being found in the reeds. It's the same story over again. At that moment, on the transcendental level, Parvati starts giving off milk, and all the drums sound in the sky, and the flowers rain down out of the sky, and there's great jubilation. That's as much as the story we're going to go into. We won't go into the avenging of the demons and such like that, but it's obviously a very much quoted myth. It is complicated, involutionary kind of myth. We see the whole notion of spiritual action, of thinking, as precipitating. So we can say that the divine character of the third is precipitation. We began saying that the nature of God, which is the nature of our very spiritual being, is creation. But that spiritual creation needs completion. And that completion comes, we see now, through thinking. But thinking precipitates. And that precipitation is indeed a fabrication, is indeed a manifestation externally from ourselves. And in the process of externalizing ourselves and being able to see what we are and contemplate ourselves in precipitate creations of ourselves, in effect, we become objectively aware of our spiritual beings, and we, so to speak, leave our body spiritually and know what we are as spiritual beings in the process of precipitation. This twofold process of externalization in matter and in spirit is the twofold process, is the whole way that objectivity is born out of action and the waking consciousness of ourselves inside and outside, so that we become completely aware of the truth that is ourself and that is becoming ourself, is the consequence of the activity of the third, and that's what this whole myth is about. One consequence of it is a blinding through desire into a phenomenal materiality that is extremely illusory, and in that process the divine becomes sterile, but it is through that sterilization that creation is reborn again in the divine. And in that, this is, I don't know how to say it, talk about a germinal creation in transcendence being manifest in material creation in a sixfold state of matter. The three above get reflected into the three below, and the three above and below become the six. And in the compound or the dual activity that we're talking about is how things are born in the six women, which represent sort of like six spheres or globes of manifestation. And from them is born an individuality as well as a personality that is the new hero, that is the reawakening of the whole being through whom the entire objectification takes place. I don't know, I'm trying to say it as fast as I can say it, and I don't know how to do it any other way. So it is a creation whose sacrifice feeds and inseminates the gods in another way, at the same time that humans are inseminated, or that creatures of illusion, and we see a perpetual parallel degeneration and regeneration taking place at the same time. Now, the real thing about this is that the jealous one, all of the divine characteristics all have astrological characteristics. And the jealous one, whether it be Jehovah or whether it be Shiva, are seen as the jealous Saturnine type of character. And it is the same concentrated Saturnian type of character that leads to this birth of sin through selfishness, selfishness is a word that has become very, very negative because of the, how would you say it, unjust, sinful way we have manifested. But this selfishness is the same thing that maintains the unity between divine and material. It is that longing for self that motivates everything in the cosmos. And the process of this focusing, just as the focusing of Shiv through the arrow sank deep into the body of Brahma, this same type of focusing is called self-contemplation. And I don't know how to say this. This is one of the deepest ideas that I have ever run into, and I'm just barely at the beginning of it. But it came up in this myth, and then it was literally in another myth, that the contemplation of self in the process of thinking, both in idea and in concretizing thought, is a process of delineation. And that process of delineation is what makes possible time. And the realization and the waking up to time in manifest reality is a consequence of the contemplation of self in knowledge and in thought, both transcendentally and materially. That self-knowing with regard to apparent illusion or new becoming reality is the birth of time. That potential of spirit being reborn in time, in the same way that matter is reborn in space, is made possible by the process of thinking. And that comes about at the point where ideas become thoughts. And so the identification of self in things which are not self things is what makes time. And the deeper the concentration and the closer we get to the point where spirit meets matter and where the idea meets the concrete thought, the deeper our realization of time and the greater the collapse of the spiritual and material worlds onto each other into a single concentrated moment comes about. I don't know how to say it any other way, but let's just break there so this isn't too ungodly long. There are a few other little myths. In fact, some really playful little myths that we'll go into next time. And I think this will work out really well because it'll allow a transition into the wrap-up of divine consciousness so that we can move into hierarchy more easily. Any other questions? I've almost literally been floating through the air at the thought of some of the ideas in here. It's just very, very rich. And this isn't even focusing on the esoteric ideas that the Hindus have.